The most exciting part of a vacation stay at a home rental? Easy. It's being greeted upon arrival with a rusted lockbox affixed to the underside of a stranger's condo. Yeah, you simply twist knobs, click gears, jiggle it, and then rip it off its moorings, and voila! Your prize is a key to a questionable home rental and maybe tetanus. When you just want to get your vacation started by actually getting into your room, it matters where you stay. At Hilton, we deliver your key right to your phone on the Hilton Honors app. Hilton, for the stay.
South Carolina's economy is growing, bringing new businesses and opportunities. The need for electricity is growing too. At Duke Energy, we're meeting the challenge, providing even more electricity that's reliable, that stays affordable. To do this, we're investing in our communities with a diverse, balanced mix of energy sources and making targeted upgrades to the grid so that South Carolina can thrive in a smarter energy future. Paid for by Duke Energy shareholders.
This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, our guest is Robin DiAngelo, author of the book, Nice Racism, How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. She looks at how well-intentioned white people can inadvertently cause racial harm through what she calls a, quote, culture of niceness. She's interviewed by Eddie Glaude, author and Princeton University professor of African American Studies.
I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to sit down and talk with you, Robin DiAngelo. If I may call you Robin, it's so exciting.
Please. Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor.
Yeah. So I want to begin with, it seems like a basic question, but it's a moment in the book where you were actually dealing with the kind of tension between class and race, and you told your story. And I thought it really important to kind of begin with your journey to this work. Talk a little bit about you and the way in which your upbringing shapes how you approach anti-racist education.
Sure. I'll talk about the aspects of my life and upbringing that I think is so relevant to the work that I do today. Two pieces, and one I'm not sure I write about in the book, and that is that my mother died when I was 11 years old. She died of leukemia. This was the late 50s, early 60s. At that time, you didn't talk about those things. It probably seems shocking to people today, but cancer was a shameful thing. And we were told not to speak about it. And when she died, we were told not to, not to talk about it afterwards either. And so it was a traumatic experience for me, but I don't think it had to be that traumatic if we had been able to talk about it. I was 11 years old. And so from an early age, I couldn't have articulated it this way at that time, but I did understand the relationship between silence and suffering. There was this huge elephant in the room, and by God, I couldn't talk about that then, but I'm going to talk about this elephant now. I also grew up in poverty because my mother was a single mother. She was struggling with this cancer. She couldn't keep a job. She couldn't keep us housed. We were often left with strangers for long periods of time. She couldn't keep us fed or bathed. I'm quite sure that I wasn't clean as a child. And I had a lot of shame. And I'll never forget that moment that all of that crystallized for me when she took my sisters and I to visit another friend, some friend. And as often happens when the adults get together, the children begin to play, and we were playing. And then it came time to leave, and I was the last one out the door. And I overheard one of the little girls ask her mother, "What's wrong with them?" That is the literal question she asked. What's wrong with them? And I stopped, riveted. I wanted to hear the answer. And her mother went like this, "Shh, they're poor." And I won't ever forget that moment. I even feel chills now because it was when I realized, okay, there's something about us that's shameful and everyone can see it, but nobody should speak of it. And I share that because when I realized much later in life that I participated in somebody else's oppression, that was unbearable to me. I cannot know the Black experience, but I can tap into the shame of poverty and discrimination based on being poor, and not want to contribute in a form of that for anybody else. I also always knew I was white. And I just have to look at white people who are poor or working class and say they don't have privilege. And I have to say, come on. I always knew I was white. I always knew it was better to be white. And in fact, we used Black people to ameliorate some of our class shame. I can remember being hungry, being out in public in a park and seeing food left out and reaching for that food and being admonished not to touch it because you don't know who touched it. Could have been, the language of the time was colored person. Don't sit there. You don't know who sat there. Could have been a colored person. And the message was clear. Had a colored person touched that, it would be dirty. Now, I was actually dirty. But in those moments, I wasn't poor anymore. I wasn't shameful anymore. It was a form of projecting our dirt and shame onto Black people. And it was the way that we aligned ourselves, or I would say realigned ourselves with the dominant white culture that our poverty separated us from. I don't have less racism because I grew up poor. I just learned my place in the racial hierarchy from a different class position than I would have learned it had I been middle class. I would have learned it there too, just different lessons would have come home to me.
So, I mean, I thought it important to begin there, to kind of give a sense of your own journey, the way in which you use your biography as a way to disrupt a kind of in some ways, false dichotomy between class and race, which is the most important, which is epiphenomenal in life. But I think it's important that we start with your story, right? That there's a journey to this work. Now, talk a little bit about, before we get to the actual book, Nice Race, talk a little bit about how white fragility changed your life. I mean, this book has been this the former book was this extraordinary hit, New York Times bestseller, #1. How has it transformed you? Because a lot of the stories in the new book come out of your travels around the country doing this extraordinary work around anti-racism education.
Like a lot of white people, particularly white people who experience a form of oppression in their life. Of course, we don't experience racial oppression, but we experience other forms. And for a lot of us, we've thought long and deep about how unjust life is for us. But rarely, I was in my 30s before how I ever considered how I benefited. And that in a large part, my whiteness allowed me to navigate my poverty. I didn't go to college until I was in my 30s. But of course, once I got there, I fit in. I was reflected everywhere by all my teachers, by the curriculum. And I graduated not knowing what I could do and got this position as what we called in the 90s a diversity trainer. And I've been doing this kind of work now for about 25 years. I went on to get my PhD. I've been writing and publishing on racism and white racial identity for decades, but mostly in academia. And I know you're an academic and you know that, does anybody read the peer-reviewed articles we write? Sometimes, maybe grad students. And I had written the article, White Fragility, about the frustration of trying to talk to white people about racism. So being a diversity trainer, going day in and day out, going against my socialization, which, most white people are taught not to talk about racism. And every day I walked into rooms filled with white people and say, we're going to talk about racism. Most often standing side by side with a Black co-facilitator who was the only person of color in most of those rooms, and just being stunned at the hostility to the conversation, at the meanness. I mean, we can be really mean on this topic, and driving home with that co-facilitator and bearing witness is part of being white, is never having to bear witness to the pain of racism on Black people, and rarely being held accountable for the pain that you cause Black people. And so that experience plus academia kind of brought me to be writing. And somebody somewhere quoted from White Fragility, the article, and it exploded. I apparently captured in language a dynamic that's been familiar, certainly to Black people, but also, once I named it, familiar to white people. And it's harder to deny a shared experience. So I was getting emails from around the world about that article. And I knew that it would be useful to develop it more further and to make it accessible, because it's an academic speak. You know, we know how to do that. It's not my favorite way to write, but, you know, you kind of have to do it in academia. I wanted to make it accessible in more plain language. And so I went to a non-academic publisher, a nonprofit social justice publisher, Beacon Press. I knew there would be an audience for the book based on the reaction to the article, but who could dream? It's still on the list. It's been 3 years. Who could dream of that? I wasn't prepared for the depth of backlash from all sides of the spectrum. I expected it from the right. You know, you expect that. That doesn't really get to you in the same way. But I didn't expect it to that degree from the left. And so that's been a process.
So that's interesting that you didn't expect it from the left. And there's a sense in which the left is not, I wouldn't want to say it too, I don't want to generalize too much, but they're caught within the crosshairs of this book. Mm-hmm. There's a sense in which I remember this moment with James Baldwin when he was testifying before Congress with Betty Shabazz. And he said something to this effect, that he was skeptical of the white liberal. Mm-hmm. He's skeptical of those who wanted to do something for him as opposed to with him. Yeah. And he had seen how white liberals had responded to the Cold War, to the McCarthy era, how they betrayed. So there is this deep suspicion in Baldwin's corpus, and you cite Baldwin, as well as Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail at the very beginning of the book. So say a little bit about nice racism. What is this? And who are these people who are the nice racists that you're talking to?
Well, it's me. We have to start with the basic foundation of systemic racism. So let's just proceed from that premise that racism occurs in explicit acts, but it's actually a structure that's infused across society. And it is the norm. It's not an aberration. It's reproduced 24/7, 365. It's a highly adaptive system. Look where we are with voters' rights. We thought in 1965 we'd settled that, and we're in a very serious place right now. So it adapts to challenges and it keeps on keeping on. And so if it is a system, we are all shaped by it. We are all shaped by it. Mm-hmm. And so for those of us who are white, we have to change our question from if I've been shaped by this system to how have I been shaped by it? You cannot be exempt from the cultural water that you swim in. And so nice racism is meant to capture the well-intended white progressive, the moderate who is more concerned with a lack of conflict, who's more concerned with comfort and saving face than racial injustice. You know, there's so much hand-wringing about white people feeling guilty. For me, that's a great example. You know, oh my goodness, white people may feel something unpleasant in looking at racism, and we're going to compare that to what we watched in front of our own eyes this summer with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so forth. So the reason I say that the white, in King's term, it was moderate. I think in Baldwin's, it was liberal. Today we say progressive. I actually think we do the most daily harm. And I don't want to speak for you. You can correct me or if I misspeak. But odds are on a daily basis, you're not interacting with white nationalists. Mm-hmm. And if you are interacting with white nationalists, you're aware that that's who you're interacting with. And right. In some ways, you know how to protect yourself. On a daily basis, especially in academia, you are most likely interacting with colleagues just like me. And we are the ones that send you home often exhausted. Those 1,000 daily cuts, that maddening, insidious, I can't get my fingers on this, but yet again, we've reproduced racism in our outcomes, in our hiring, in our policies. Mm-hmm. So it's the more subtle. It's the smile on the face. It's the gaslighting. It's the denying.
South Carolina's economy is growing, bringing new businesses and opportunities. The need for electricity is growing too. At Duke Energy, we're meeting the challenge, providing even more electricity that's reliable, that stays affordable. To do this, we're investing in our communities with a diverse, balanced mix of energy sources and making targeted upgrades to the grid so that South Carolina can thrive in a smarter energy future. Paid for by Duke Energy shareholders.
You invoke guilt. In the book, you make a distinction between shame and guilt. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in just a condensed version, guilt is generally what you feel about something you've done and feel responsible for. And shame is generally something you feel that you inherently are. So guilt is I did bad, and shame is I am bad. And my area of scholarship is discourse analysis. And so, language is political. Language is not objective. It's not neutral. And language shapes perception. And so I'm very attentive to how we frame conversations and how we position ourselves in conversations. And I notice that white progressives, those who would voluntarily attend a talk or watch a video like this, will pretty freely talk about feeling shame and I don't know what to do. I feel so much shame, but not guilt. And that's interesting to me, right? That's worthy of note. This is a pattern. And as a sociologist, I think patterns are rich sources of insight. So how does it function? If I feel guilty, I'm responsible for something, and reparative action would be to somehow address what I have done. If I feel shame, I just am bad, and there's nothing I can do. I'm absolved from responsibility, and shame tends to elicit sympathy, support. If I say I feel so ashamed, I'm such a bad person, most people around me are going to reassure me. No. Nobody should feel shame. We're all inherently good. This is a pretty popular progressive mantra. And so it functions in the environment in ways that actually, I think, garner more social capital.
Yeah, in some ways, I think you used a formulation like the fact that I feel badly actually establishes that I'm actually a decent person, that I'm a good person, right?
Yes.
But what's interesting is that as you know, in certain kind of political theorist circles, it's the absence of shame in our politics that represents a certain kind of problem, right? So Chris LeBron writes about the fact that, Trump, people thought that shame could actually move Trump around, right? And there's a sense that there's no feeling of shame, that on the right, it's the absence of shame that allows them to do X, Y, and Z. And it seems to me, after reading Nice Racism, it's the prevalence of shame on the left. I know this is too binary, but it's the prevalence of prevalence of shame on the left that actually enables, in certain interesting sorts of ways. So I found this talk about the feeling of guilt as really, really a kind of critical intervention. Because there seems to be always, at least in my work and in my conversations, I'm not in the zone that you're in by any stretch of the imagination, but there's this sense in which we cannot sit in our discomfort.
Yeah.
Because because we find ourselves not only feeling guilty, but feeling shame, and feeling this sense that, we're not in fact decent. And then that gums up the works, as it were. We can't get to where we want to get to.
Yeah, well, shame is a very unpleasant feeling. So with guilt, shame is probably worse. But can we, buck up? Can we bear it? Can we build our capacity to feel it and move through it? And that's the key. There's a question that has never failed me in my efforts to unpack. How do we keep getting the outcomes we get? Virtually every white person you talk to, even those who are caught on camera engaging in racism, will claim that they're not racist.
Right.
So then how do we keep getting racism, as what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls racism without racists?
Right.
So the question that has really served me in trying to figure that out is not, is this right or wrong? Is it right or wrong that you feel shame? No. That we could split hairs over forever. It's how does it function? And how does it function in this context? And if it functions to motivate you to build your capacity, to move through it, to change the way you understand what's being said, well, then it's functioning in a constructive way. But if it's functioning to excuse your inaction, to be the reason you don't engage, to cause everyone around you to walk on eggshells and be so careful and don't say this and don't say that, well, then it's functioning to protect the racist status quo.
So chapter 5 stood out to me. It's the longest chapter in the book. And it is a detailed accounting of what you call the moves of white progressives. And I found it fascinating, beyond from credentialing to outwoking. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about outwoking in the context of some of the debates we saw in the Bernie Sanders campaign, between Bernie Sanders, the campaign, and Black Lives Matter, or some of the conversations we overheard with Occupy Wall Street. Right at the very moment Occupy is taking off, Black Lives Matter is taking off, and we were wondering, some of us, why weren't these things coming together? It's like abolitionism and free soil. Why are they going in separate directions in interesting sorts of ways? Talk a little bit about the moves of white progressivism and why you thought it was so important to lay out, because I didn't have language to say, oh, that's what that was, or fascinating. Yes, that seems familiar to me. Talk a little bit about that chapter and lay out why it's in some ways, Robin, the heart of the book in some ways.
Yeah, and I appreciate you, if I understood you correctly, acknowledging that it resonated. You've experienced these moves. You've been on the receiving end of these moves. I am an educator, and I think one of the things that I'm effective at is breaking it down and showing what it looks like. Here's how I can help you understand what you're doing and how it's functioning. And so if the book is about the ways in which we perpetrate racial harm, then I need to make that very, very clear. And I've been observing it, receiving it, participating in it. I'm not outside anything that I write about for 20 plus years. And so I just wanted the opportunity to say, all right, let's take it apart. What do we do? So credentialing is a really big one because it's so predictable that the moment a white progressive encounters a Black person or is, engaging across race, they're going to feel a need to establish that they're not racist. And unfortunately, most of the ways we seek to do that are not remotely convincing. And I've been in enough conversation with Black colleagues and friends who are like, our eyes are rolling on the inside. And so another piece would be, you're making a fool of yourself. We're making a fool of ourselves. Would you want to know? I'd want to know if I came out of the bathroom and my skirt was tucked up into my pantyhose and my bottom was showing, and you came up to me and say, heads up, is visible. I would be like, oh my God, thank you so much, and pull my skirt down. I wouldn't say, how dare you? No, it isn't. And everybody better proceed as if they don't see anything, right? And of course, that's white fragility. But I see two overall categories of credentialing. Colorblind. White progressives are less likely to go into colorblind. We're going to go into proximity. And have you noticed how often white people will use proximity to Black people as their evidence that they are free of racism? I had a Black roommate in college. I went to this school. I work on a diverse team. I've traveled, the world. I live in a big, big city. Therefore, I have proximity. And what I try to help people do with that is say, okay, so if your evidence that you're not racist is that you can tolerate proximity, you can walk down the street in a large major city and pass Black people and not lose it, then in order for that to be good evidence, it has to not be possible by somebody who's racist, right? Otherwise, that's not good race. That's not good evidence. Mm-hmm. So apparently, racists can't have proximity to Black people. And I think right here, you see that's ridiculous. That's absurd. We can go all the way. We can go back to days of enslavement and Jim Crow, and we're quite clear that white racists had proximity, pretty intimate proximity at times, to Black people. Mm-hmm. And so I want them to see what they're doing when they do that they're not convincing anybody. And to reveal the underlying framework that they're operating from. Mm-hmm. And we just cannot get where we need to go from that framework that says racism consists of individual acts of intentional meanness. That's most white people's definition. This is why most white people will say they're not racist, and why to support their case, their friends will say how nice they are. Exactly. He's a nice guy. He can't be racist. Those things are mutually exclusive. Right? I
had this experience recently on television with my good friend, Senator Claire McCaskill. Mm. There was a moment when Senator Blunt from Missouri described the For the People Act and Senator Manchin's amendments, or his version, his response to it. And when Stacey Abrams endorsed Manchin's compromise, Blunt described it as the Stacey Abrams bill. Mm. And someone said, well, obviously what he's trying to do is put a black face on this, Yep. And the response from my good friend was, he's not a racist. He's a nice guy. Right. So it was exactly this language.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about outwoking, because a lot of folks are experiencing this today as well. Talk a little bit about outwoking.
Yeah. I had a thought there about that example.
So you could give
it flew out. That's why I take notes. Yes. Okay. So outwoking is a move that white people often make to show I'm more down than you are. I know more about this than you do. And I've got a lot of it. I read your book. And so now I'm actually more down than you. And now I'm going to call you out, that I've been studying this for 3 months, and I'm going to tell Robin DiAngelo, how wrong she is. Oh, I just got the thought back. Sometimes I'll go to YouTube and I'll see something, 5 reasons why Robin DiAngelo is wrong. And the top one will be, she says all white people are racist. Can you believe that? And what I want to ask pretty much every white person to do is take a moment and define for yourself, what is the criteria by which you would grant that somebody's racist? What is the criteria? I don't think many white people have thought deeply about that, right? If you're astounded that I would say all white people are racist, then tell me what you think it takes. And it's probably going to come down to some version of individual conscious meanness across race. And that framework, that paradigm just couldn't be more effective at protecting racism because it exempts virtually all white people, guarantees defensiveness, right? Guarantees that then nice people couldn't possibly participate. And then we end up with racism without racists. Yeah. And so let me just be clear, since I said it, when I say all white people are racist, what I mean is that we live in a society in which it is infused. Racist ideology is circulating all the time. The vast majority of white people live segregated lives and not only feel no loss about that, which for me is the deepest message of all, that I could go cradle to grave, as most white people will, with no authentic, sustained relationship with Black people. And not only not feel anything of value has been missing, but define my life as gaining value virtue the absence of Blacks.
This is really a key point here.
Yes,
I'm
right?
sorry. Yeah.
Like, what's a good school? What's a good neighborhood? What's happening when a neighborhood's going up, coming up? What's happening when it's coming down? What are we talking about when a violent crime happens and somebody has to say on camera, you wouldn't believe that would ever happen here? Mm-hmm. That you already know what kind of neighborhood we're talking about. And it begs the question, well, where should that happen? Right. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, this is a key point. In my own work, I talk about what I call the value gap. This belief that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. And that valuation then evidences itself in the distribution of advantage and disadvantage, right? Where some people are treated with a generalized sense of disregard that accumulates over time, right? And others benefit. And this is not the result of loud racists, but actually the result, or it is sustained over time to how we're habituated.
Yes.
Right. That all of us are habituated to kind of live the value gap. These racial habits are at the heart of our way of living. And so when I read this in Nice Racism, I never really thought about it in this way, that we know that our social groups are homogeneous, right? For the most part, that, when people talk about, network racism, right? They're talking about the fact that our networks are so homogeneous that opportunities aren't passed along, right? In certain networks because they're not strong, other networks because they're robust. I'm not playing golf when I'm 14, 15, 16 with my friend's dad and the like. So there is this sense in which this segregated world, white world, right? Which accords all of these benefits and advantage, right? Almost, as you put it earlier, this is the water you swim in. You can't come out of that without it a drop on you. And so it reminds me of that moment in Wendell Berry's The Hidden Wound, right? Mm-hmm. Where he says racism comes to him as natural as language.
Yeah, yeah.
As this Kentucky-born guy, white guy. So I know I'm rambling, but what do you make of that?
No. It's such an important point because it's such a sticking point. And then this gets us up against the very precious ideology of individualism.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Right.
Which causes lots of white people to melt down into white fragility. You don't know me. How can you say anything about me? And it's true. I don't know all of you. I don't know most of the white people I'm talking about. That's on each individual white person to look at, all right, how have I been shaped by this? What was my class position? What's my gender? What have been my life experiences within a society that, no, I'm just going to go here. White supremacy, the idea that white is the stand-in for human, the ideal human. And the further you are away from that standard, the less human. As Resmaa Menakem argues, it's really a argument about species, that the white body is the standard by which all bodies, humanity shall be measured. I'm quoting Resmaa Menakem now. And so the further you are away from that whiteness, then the less human you are. Right? That's the society we live in. And we're all shaped by it. So that's why I say we change the question from if to how.
How.
Yeah. And it's similar with gender. I don't think anybody would argue that the moment a baby is born and the declaration is made, boy or girl, a whole set of socialization kicks in and you cannot avoid it. The blanket they wrap you in is going to be shaped by whatever gender they see you as. And you can resist it, but you're going to have to resist it. And you're going to have to resist it every step of the way from everyone you meet. They're going to be responding to you consciously or not as a male or a female. These categories are being challenged, but none of us can be exempt from it, from gender conditioning. And yet we think we can be exempt from racial conditioning. So if that framework is helpful, I would offer it to white people to use.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I had a thought because I can imagine what I call the yeah buts, right?
Yeah.
So the white folks are listening going, well, yeah, but Eddie just said he lives segregated life overall too, or that most of his friendship circle. Yeah. The difference is Black people who may also live separate from white people. One, that is the result of decades and decades and decades of policies and practices that were forced on Black people. This idea that people prefer to live with their own. I don't think some people prefer to live with their own with all the resources, and some prefer with none of the resources, right? That's been imposed. And so now it seems natural, but it is the result of those policies. And you're not sitting at the table as a homogeneous group of people making decisions that affect my life. But my group is sitting at that table making decisions that affect your life. Can you see that picture in your mind of the governor of Georgia surrounded by other white men signing the voting restriction with the picture of the plantation behind him? So yes, Biden's administration will be the most diverse administration we've ever had, but not one person listening right now was raised in a society in which Biden's administration is the norm. And all our conditioning doesn't unravel the moment there's some diversity in front of us. The people who are enacting these policies, banning, whether you and I could be having this conversation on a college campus, who has the power to ban these conversations? Not your group, my group.
Just listening to you, it reminded me of a moment in the book that I found really, really, really interesting. And it's these deeply personal moments, right? So my social groupings are predominantly Black. They're people of color, because it's exhausting at times, right? And then you have to make the decision. You wrote about this in the book. The people who are in your close circles, who happen to be white, who are white, I make a distinction. Yeah. Let me just say, there's a distinction between being white and happening to be white. Let's make that distinction. You have to make a decision in those moments. Do I risk our friendship to tell him or her what she just did or what he just did? Do I just let that slide, or do we just move on? Do I have to interpret the drums today? Right? That is always being asked to give an account for Y, A, B, and C, right? So there's a sense in which there's not only the kind of broad macro questions or issues that you've described, but there are also the internal demands that are placed on relationships, interracial relationships. And I got this in a sense in your own book. When you found yourself doing certain things, you would call your Black friends to say, who do similar work, and they would have to walk you through it, right? And what kind of labor that is? That's an additional kind of labor that you don't have with other kinds of friends, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. There are two concepts that are useful for me here. And one is allostatic load, and that refers to chronic stressors. So lots of people carry allostatic load, but racial weathering is the result of allostatic load that is due to the stress of living in a society in which systemic racism is the foundation. And, all that agony, right? Here I am, I just said that thing. It's coming from a racist assumption. It's coming from implicit bias, but I'm oblivious to it, and I say it and I carry on. I had a great time at the party, and you are spending that, hours agonizing. Is it worth it to talk to her? Will I risk losing the relationship? How often has this gone well for me? You know what? It's not worth it. Unfortunately, as I argued in White Fragility, often the punishment gets worse, not better. And so that's why I see white fragility as a kind of everyday white racial bullying, a form of everyday white racial control. Is that right? So we have this interaction, and then you really have to work to think about whether it's worth it to talk to me. And maybe you just decide, no, it's not. I got to get through the day. I got to take care of my family at home. And so, I didn't get called in. I wasn't accountable. The racism got to fly. You got to bear the brunt of it. And, we keep on keeping on with me being comfortable and you being uncomfortable. I want to share a really powerful moment that drives this home. I was in front of a group. This is back in the day when you could be in front of groups. And I'd gone over white fragility and all of these dynamics. And I posed a question to the people of color in the room. I said, how often have you tried to give a white person feedback on our inevitable and often unaware racist habits and assumptions and had that go well for you? They laugh, they roll their eyes. The number one response is never. The number two response is rarely. And I followed up by asking, well, what if you could just give us that feedback and had us receive it with grace, reflect, and seek to change our behavior? What would that be like? And I'll never forget this Black man raised his hand and he said, it would be revolutionary. I mean, revolutionary is a really strong word, right? I mean, that's how difficult white people are. That is a frickin', if I may, revolution. Give us the feedback and have us receive it with grace, reflect, and seek to change. That's how difficult we are. On the other hand, that doesn't seem like a very tall order. It really doesn't, but it is a tall order from the current paradigm that says only bad people could be racist. That guarantees that I'm going to have to defend myself. And then you're going to be in the position of deciding whether it's worth it.
So this is a wonderful way of kind of panning out a bit, right? Because the work speaks to these cross-racial, interracial relationships, the kind of personal interactions and how they run aground, the moment in which our allies are approaching this as a philanthropic issue. They're not seeing themselves. They understand themselves as decent. I mean, we can go through all the language, right? But we're in a moment where we're seeing this work at the macro in very, very clear ways. Mm-hmm. So Senator Tim Scott declares America is not a racist country. Vice President Kamala Harris echoes, we're not a racist country, but we have to deal with our racist past. Okay, another kind of moment. Critical race theory as the catch-all phrase for the kind of work that you do, the kind of work that Ibram Kendi does, right? This effort to kind of re-narrate 1619 Project, right? All of these are attempts to kind of tell a different story about our beginnings, about who we are, confronting our wrongdoings and the like. And we see the depth of the vitriol. We see the intensity of the response. Reading Nice Racism, you have it at the level of interpersonal relationship, but we see it broadly across the country at large. So bring the two together for me, Dr. DiAngelo. Talk about Nice Racism and talk about where we are as a country in this moment, which is what's supposed to be a moment of profound possibility and transfer.
I think precisely because it is a moment of profound possibility, we're seeing incredibly amplified efforts to stop it from being that moment. So Carol Anderson so beautifully argues in White Rage, every inch of Black progress has been met by white rage. I believe that the current moment is a backlash to the Obama presidency. I think that this blocking of critical race theory is a reaction to what happened this summer, and that more and more white people are being awoken and galvanized to get involved. The forces that are invested in racial justice are deep, but the forces that are invested in maintaining the racist status quo are also very, very deep, and for the most part have the reins of power. So I see both those kind of sides, if you will, absolutely amplified. And I don't believe that those who want to protect the racist status quo can come out and say that. They can't. So they have to find a boogeyman, which they have always been effective at doing, right? The Southern strategy, where you manipulate the white populace's racial animus, you cause them to be afraid, you reinforce this idea of scarcity, that any gain for you is a loss for me. Heather McGhee talks about that in The Sum of Us. Jonathan Metzl talks about it in
Dying White.
Dying of Whiteness, right? So critical race theory, and I just heard Tim Weiss call it conservative race theory. It's a stand-in for anyone who acknowledges that systemic racism is real. But it's the perfect stand-in, in a way, to cover that. So you have the word critical. And outside of academia, a lot of people hear that as meaning criticism. And that sounds bad, right? Within academia, critical thinking means thinking deeply with nuance and with education. And then you have the word theory. Oh, that sounds like some radical crackpot thing. If it's just a theory, then it's not, true or established. And it's such a perfect little meme to dismiss the conversation. And it's being very effective. There's a part of me that doesn't even want to talk about it because I don't want to reinforce the legitimacy, of, is CRT right or wrong? So let me be clear. True critical race theory, of course, comes out of legal scholarship, like Kimberly Crenshaw's work and Derek Bell. So I am not a critical race theorist, but of course it's been applied. The premise is that racism is structured into the society, and that absolutely.
Right. So, like you switched the question to how.
Yeah.
With regards to the critical race theory debate, I want to ask the question, why? Why critical race theory? Why now? Why so it seems to me that these moments, to assert that America is not racist, Tim Scott, to attack 1619, to attack CRT, right? All of this is aimed at, as we said at the beginning of this particular conversation, is aimed at arresting change, right? To limit the scope of remedy. We're not bad, so we can't engage in this wholesale, transformation of who we are. We're not that. We're this. So instead of debating CRT on its merits, because these folk don't even know what it is most of the time, right? We need to ask ourselves, why is this being asked? But I want to get to this really quick, because it seems to me that this is where nice racism is so important at the level of politics. Because you have the two sides as you've described them. And I don't want to make, all of those persons on the right, daily callers, subscribers, or white nationalists or the like. There's differentiation there.
Yes.
But there seems to be some level of solidarity with regards to maintaining the idea that America must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. On the other side, though, you have nice racists. Those who are fighting for a more just America, who claim, this is what makes your book so interesting to me at a certain level, is that among those who are supposedly fighting against those folks, you have the Joe Manchins and the like. And you can use your text to see what he's doing in real time at the level of politics. So talk a little bit about what does it mean for these people to be on the side of a more just world?
Yeah. I hope white people keep fighting. I hope nice white people are out there fighting. Unfortunately, I haven't seen that the energy that we saw last summer is being sustained. Running down to a protest on some level is exciting and exhilarating, but the daily work of putting racism on the table, looking at your policies and practices in the workplace, challenging one another, that's the really hard stuff. Mm-hmm. And in case I don't say it earlier or later, it takes courage. It takes commitment, but it also takes courage. And niceness is not courageous. So my point around that is that so many white people see the presence of niceness as an indicator of the absence of racism. And a culture of niceness is actually one that prevents us having difficult conversations about racism. It's generally a culture that's nice for me, but not necessarily nice for you. There's this idea that the way that I experience the world must be the way that you experience the world. So I find our campus to be a very welcoming place. So wouldn't you feel it to be a welcoming place? Or this idea that if a policy is applied to everybody, then it's fair, even if the outcomes are not going to be the same. Mm-hmm. Right? So it takes a lot of commitment and courage. And that I want to see sustained. And this kind of ties back to the outwoking. The moment I think that I've arrived, I'm going to be complacent. I'm also going to be defensive about any feedback to the contrary. Any idea, this is why one of the chapters is called There Is No Choir. The moment I think I'm the choir, I'm going to be part of the problem. There is a level of humility that white people need to have, a level of understanding that this construct is hundreds of years old at this point. It's nuanced, it's complicated, it's charged, it's not simple. It's not going to change just because we are friends. And so my learning will never be finished.
Mm. But what about my trauma, Robin?
Well, I'm curious because you teach in college classrooms, I assume, and you probably, when you start to talk about race, you may see some of these moves. So there's a chapter called What About My Trauma? And that's a pattern that I often see amongst progressive white people, that as soon as we start having hard conversations where they become implicated, right? We're not going to talk about it out here. We're not going to, talk about everybody else's challenges. We're going to, whatever we talk about, we're going to ask you to connect it to yourself. So what does that look like in your life, right? The number one question I get when I give a talk is, how do I tell my friend about racism? And I reply like this: well, how would I tell you about your racism? Right? Because the question always implies that it's not me. I'm good to go. I have to go forth and tell other people. So as soon as it starts to implicate us, many white progressives will move into their own pain and their own hurt. Right. Maybe you could imagine it starts getting hard. I start feeling implicated, and I'm going to start talking about growing up poor and how those people said that thing about me when I was young and how that hurt me. And now I'm going to be a victim, right? Or I'm going to say this conversation is bringing up my old traumas and I can't continue in this conversation. And I wanted to call that in. And again, ask people to think deeply. So how's it functioning in the conversation? What happens to the conversation when you move to that place? And I also want to push people have trauma. I'm not denying that you have trauma, but I am going to hold firm that talking about racism isn't in and of itself traumatic.
So here we are.
For white people.
Yes. So here we are. We've had this wonderful conversation. People have come to you. They've read White Fragility. They're going to read Nice Racism. Hopefully they're going to read some of those articles too. The scholarship that informs it all.
Thank you.
What is the source of hope for the work that you do and what you've seen over the years of doing this work? Where's your source of hope? This is a way not that we have to end with hope, because
Yeah.
that's that typical American narrative.
Yep.
But talk a little bit about what you see on the immediate horizon as you continue to do this work.
Well, I'm an educator, so I'm going to say a little bit about the politics of hope before I say what gives me hope. I think hope is political because it drives behaviors and responses, just like I think emotions are political because they are informed by the framework through which we're making meaning, which is why if you told me 20 years ago what you're doing is racist, I would have interpreted that through a particular framework, and it would have had a set of emotions, and they would have triggered some responses, which would have been at that time white fragility. And today I have a different framework, and so I have very different feelings if you were to say that to me. Mm-hmm. And hope functions similarly. Now, it doesn't function the same for Black people as it does for white people. I can't speak to your relationship to that concept, but what I can tell you is after 25 years of doing this work and seeing where we are right now, do I struggle with hopelessness? Yes, I do. And I cannot go there. As a white person, I can't go there. I cannot succumb to it because the moment I do, great, give up. And who does that serve? What does that serve? Because it's a system that benefits me. If I give up hope within it, if I give up hope to fight it, I collude with it and continue to benefit from it. On the other hand, too much hope can make me Pollyanna, right? And can cause me to be complacent. And, there were lots of white folks who felt completely hopeful following the civil rights movement of the 60s. And look where we are. So it is something I navigate. I have to push through it. But what gives me hope is there's a couple maybe concrete things that on the stage, the world stage of the Democratic debates, reparations for Black people was discussed with absolute legitimacy. I didn't think that would happen in my lifetime. Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic on reparations is brilliant and powerful and started to make headway in the culture. Mm-hmm. There was a time when you couldn't critique capitalism. Right. And there's a time when you couldn't say white supremacy. And now from the president's office, I'm talking about Biden, he's saying systemic racism and white supremacy are among the most urgent issues of our time. That's incredible. And it gives me hope. And it's tempered by the fact that we'll see what happens when he isn't president anymore, whether that be 4 years from now or 12 years from now.
Well, it has been an absolute delight to have an opportunity to talk with you. And I'm reminded of a wonderful phrase from Jimmy Baldwin. He says, hope is invented every day. And if you have to invent it every day, that means you're battling despair every day. So we're going to keep fighting no matter what. Well, so it's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. Be sure to check out our Book Notes Plus podcast. This week, historian and attorney David Stewart talks about the political career of George Washington and his evolution from an egotistical military hero to founding father of the United States. Find it and follow wherever you listen to podcasts.